Okay, one of the more useful things that we can do with the ECG is measure heart rate. So there are essentially three ways that we can measure heart rate fairly easily. So these three methods that we will look at are the 1500 method, what we're going to call the triplet method, although I've seen it called other things in other places, and we'll call the third one the 6-second method. So let's start with the 1500 method. So how do we measure heart rate on ECG using the 1500 method? Well, to start with the 1500 method, you have to remember that one small box on the ECG equals 0.04 seconds. Now, if we're trying to get a heart rate in terms of beats per minute, so a minute is 60 seconds, well, 60 seconds divided by 0.04 seconds equals 1500. So that's where the 1500 comes from. So what we're going to look at is how many of these small boxes, what's the number of small boxes between one R wave and the next R wave. So remember, the R waves are part of that QRS complex that represents when the ventricles contract. So that's a heartbeat. And then what we're going to do with the number of small boxes between R waves is we'll divide them into 1500. And what that should tell us then is your heart rate. So let's take an example. So here I have an ECG I'm going to draw here. And we're just going to assume each one of these is a heartbeat. This is a QRS complex. This isn't what an ECG really looks like, but for simplification, these are our R waves in our QRS complex. So each one of these is an R wave. All right. And so what we're going to do is we're going to measure from the tip of one R wave to the tip of the other R wave. Now remember, on our ECG paper, our electrocardiogram, there will be boxes everywhere. And so based on this, what we can do is we'll go through and we'll count up the number of boxes between the R waves. Now, let's just assume that there are 18 small boxes here. So if that was the case, if we counted 18 small boxes between the peak of each of these subsequent R waves, 1500 divided by 18 would give us a heart rate of about 83 beats per minute. And so we look at this ECG and say, well, your heart rate's 83. And we just had to look at two R waves. The issue here is, what if between these two R waves, I counted 19 small boxes? Well, 1500 divided by 19 gives us 79 beats per minute. So depending on how good you are at counting boxes, and if there was any difference between the number of boxes between these two R waves and these two R waves, your heart rate's going to be slightly different. So as long as the distance between R waves, so the distance from R to R, is regular, that basically means the distance between any two R waves is the same on the whole ECG, you're okay to use the 1500 method. However, if you have what we call an irregular rhythm, this is not a good method to use. Case in point, these are R waves again. Now, if we looked at the distance between these two R waves, clearly this is the distance here for the first set of R waves, A. There's going to be a lot more small boxes. It's going to be a lot slower heart rate. If you look at the distance between the next two R waves, we'll call that distance B. That's a much shorter distance, and that's going to give you a much higher heart rate, and they're going to vary considerably. So we can't use the 1500 method if the rhythm is too irregular. So let's take a look at another method. well, how about this triplet method? And my pen isn't working very well right now. So we're going to look at the triplet method. So when you do the triplet method, again, we're going to look at the distance between two R waves, or we'll call it an R to R interval. Distance between any two R waves. And when you do the triplet method, what you're looking at is each set of three boxes, three large boxes. That's why they call it a triplet. We're going to look at sets of three large boxes. And when you look at each set of three boxes, the heart rate will drop a set amount. All right, so let's look at an example. Here we have an R wave, and another R wave, and another R wave. So what we'll do is we'll look at how many big boxes are between these R waves. And let's just say the R wave landed on the start of this big box, and this R wave was at the very end of this big box. What we do is we say, well, if the R wave would have been here, the heart rate would have been 300. And if it would have been here, it would have been 150, and here it would have been 100. So that's your first triplet. 300, 150, 100. And your next triplet is 75, 60, and 50. 75, 60, and 50. So what we can see is our R wave landed at the end of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fifth big box, which gives us a heart rate of 60. So this is roughly a heart rate of 60. Now if the R wave would have landed in between two big boxes, well, you would just split the difference. So there's a difference of 25 beats here between 175. So we'd say this is probably about 87 beats per minute. So your triplet method is fairly quick and easy to do as long as you can line a R wave up at the start of a big box, and then you just go 300, 150, 100, 75, 60, 50, and see where that next R wave lands, and that'll give you a very quick rough estimate of the heart rate. Again, this is more of a crude way to measure heart rate. It's not going to be super accurate. So what we want is a more accurate way to do this, and a way that we can use when the rhythm is irregular. And that's where the 6-second method comes in. So remember, a big box is 0.20 seconds in duration. So if we had 30 big boxes, that's 6 seconds. So if we know how many heartbeats we had in 6 seconds, if we could multiply that by 10, well, that's 60 seconds. That's 1 minute. So that would tell us our heart rate in beats per minute. So in the 6-second method, basically what we're doing is looking at the number of R to R intervals in 30 big boxes, and we multiply that by 10. And that will give us our heart rate in beats per minute. So again, let's draw ourselves an ECG with just the R waves. So if a big box started here and we counted 30 big boxes and it ended right here, what we would do is, how many R to R intervals are there? Well, there's 1 R to R interval. There's 2. There's 3, 4. And our big boxes stop right here. That's half an R to R interval. So we have 4.5 R to R intervals. So we take 4.5 and 4.5 times 10 means our heart rate is 45 beats per minute. Now this will work even if the rhythm is quite irregular. Since you're doing this over 6 seconds, you'll still get a very good average for the heart rate, regardless of whether or not the R to R intervals vary from one to the next. So this is a great method to use. Now, In addition to that, if you happen to have a Bic brand pin and you have the cap on it, you have to have the cap on it, believe it or not, the length of that pin with its cap is about 30 big boxes. And so what makes this really nice is you can just drop your Bic pin on the ECG and count the number of R to R intervals from the beginning to the end of that Bic pin and multiply by 10. So you don't actually have to count out 30 big boxes because that does take time. So the Bic pin makes the 6-second method much easier when you're actually doing this in practice in the clinic or wherever you're interpreting your ECG. So just a quick recap here. We have 3 methods for calculating heart rate from the ECG. Now the ECG will already calculate this for you, but there are times in which you want to double check because artifact on the ECG can mess with the heart rate calculation. So we have the 1500 method, where you're taking the number of small boxes between any 2 R waves, dividing into 1500, and that will give you the heart rate. But it does not work if the rhythm is irregular. So if the R to R intervals vary a lot, that doesn't really work. Now the triplet method, you simply have to remember the set of numbers 300, 150, 100, 75, 60, 50. So if there's 1 big box between R waves, the rate's 300. If it's 2, it's 150. And then 100, 75, 60, 50 from there. Okay, very quick, very easy to do, but kind of a rough estimate. And then the last one is the 6-second method. It works well with irregular rhythms, and it's relatively quick if you have a Bic pin. You just start at an R wave, and you count how many intervals there are during that 30 big boxes, and you multiply by 10 to get your heart rate. All right. So that finishes up for video 3 on heart rate calculations.